Every vacation. My family claimed not enough room while my sister's family took over everything. That was the line that played in my head like clockwork every July, no matter how much time passed or how much I accomplished. That single sentence seemed to define my place in our family. My name is Andrea Russet. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I work as a senior experience strategist for a luxury hotel group, where my job is to make guests feel like they matter the moment they step through the door. Funny, isn't it? How the person who spends her days designing comfort and belonging for strangers never quite had a place of her own in her own family. I grew up in Sacramento, the younger daughter of Daniel and Elsie Russet. My older sister Bianca has always been the sun of our family system. Bright and unmissable. I, on the other hand, was the shadow that filled the gaps. The first time I realized how this dynamic played out wasn't during a fight or a moment of confrontation. It was subtle, like most betrayals in polite families. I was 12 when Bianca was allowed to bring a friend to our lake house vacation, and I wasn't. That summer, I slept on a folded futon in the hallway while Bianca and her best friend shared a queen bed in the guest room. Mom said I should be flexible and grateful to be included. That word, included, stayed with me like a tag stitched onto my back. Not welcomed, not expected, included, as in optional. As I grew older, things didn't change. Bianca went to college close to home, married young, had 2 kids, and now lives in the Bay Area. I moved to Seattle, built a career from scratch, worked through nights and holidays, and bought my own condo by 30. And yet, every summer, I was still the one sleeping near the laundry room or in a pop-up cot by the back door while Bianca's family occupied the master bedroom, the kids' room, and a makeshift playroom that somehow always displaced my things. I never fought it outright. I internalized it. I reasoned with myself. I told myself families have patterns, and being single meant I didn't need as much. Maybe the kids did need consistency. Maybe I was being dramatic. It wasn't until 2 years ago that I started feeling the strain more viscerally. I began experiencing migraines the week leading up to the trip. I found myself dreading the packing, the drive, the predictable discomfort. But it was only this year, in early June, that something in me shifted. I opened the annual email from my mother. The subject line hadn't changed in over a decade. Russet Family Vacation, July 14th to 28. I knew what I'd find before I even clicked. Bianca and Jared were assigned the master suite. Mason and Chloe got their usual room, and my name appeared at the bottom. Next to the words, fold-out couch plus Jared will bring memory foam topper again. That last line stung. Not only was I not offered a room, I was being preemptively soothed with foam. A patch for a wound they wouldn't acknowledge. That night, I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I reread it, zoomed in like maybe I had missed a line offering something more. I hadn't. The message was clear. Not enough room. Again. I didn't cry. I didn't respond. I closed the email and sat there in my apartment, surrounded by the minimalist furniture I had chosen with care, the soft lighting I had set for comfort, the plants I kept alive better than most relationships. I sat in the quiet and realized I was angry, not because they forgot me, but because they remembered me exactly the same way every year. As the one who adjusts, the one who makes do, the one who doesn't take up space. At work, I managed multi-million-dollar experience designs across 5 hotel properties. I led teams, I made decisions, but at that lake house, I was still the girl who got the leftovers and smiled. That weekend, I had lunch with Lena, my closest friend and former project partner, someone who had seen me rise and unravel in equal measure. When I told her about the email, she didn't even blink. She said, "They treat you like an intern in your own family. You realize that?" Right? I laughed. Because it was true. She added, "So what are you going to do this time? sleep next to the pantry, and call it bonding. That hit harder than I expected. I didn't know yet what I would do, but I knew I couldn't keep repeating the same pattern and hoping someone else would notice it was broken. Something had to shift, and for the first time in my adult life, I was beginning to think that shift had to start with me. But what would happen if I didn't just make do this year? What if I said no? I didn't respond to the email for 2 days. Usually, I would reply within the hour with some emoji-filled acknowledgement, maybe a casual joke about bringing my own pillow again. But that year, I sat on it. I went to work like normal, reviewed pitch decks for a boutique spa hotel opening in Jackson Hole, led a creative sprint on scent-based guest immersion, and had back-to-back meetings about lighting psychology. Yet underneath all of it, that email was humming like a loose wire in my mind. Not because of the sleeping arrangement itself, it wasn't just about a fold-out couch, it was about the assumption that I would accept it. Again, no conversation, no question, no pause. Just the default Andrea gets what's left. On Thursday, I took a long walk after dinner. I live in a quiet neighborhood near Green Lake, with tidy sidewalks and old trees that know too many secrets. I walked until my calves ached and my head cleared. Then I opened my notes app and started listing things that had never been said. Not to my parents, not to Bianca, not even out loud to myself. I don't want to be the backup option in my own family. I don't want to be congratulated for being flexible when it means being invisible. I don't want to sleep near the dog crate and call it closeness. Just writing those lines made my breath feel different. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't keep playing the same part. I closed the app and promised myself something small but radical. This year, I would not show up like furniture. The next day, I brought it up with Dr. Haley during our session. She was the first therapist I had seen in years who didn't rush to comfort or reframe. She listened, leaned in, and asked a single question. What would saying no look like to you? It was surprisingly difficult to answer. I said maybe I wouldn't go, or maybe I would go but stay off site, or maybe I'd just reply to the email with a boundary. Something like, I'd love to join, but I can't keep sleeping on a couch. She nodded, then waited. I added, I'm scared that if I push back, they'll act like I'm the one causing a problem. She didn't argue. She just said, and what if the problem has been pretending everything's fine? That night, I Googled short-term rentals near Point Montera, where our family beach house sat on a bluff overlooking the Pacific. I found a quiet little inn 5 minutes away. Nothing fancy. Just clean, peaceful, with a balcony facing the water and a breakfast basket left at your door each morning. I bookmarked it, then closed the tab. I wasn't ready to book yet, but just knowing I had options changed something. For once, I had an exit. I didn't have to stay in the role I'd been assigned just because it was familiar. Bianca called that weekend. She wanted to check in and make sure I'd seen Mom's message. I told her I had. She didn't ask what I thought. She just launched into the usual updates. Mason had a robotics camp coming up. Chloe was learning piano. Jared might get promoted again. Then came the line I always dreaded but could recite from memory. You'll love spending time with the kids. They've missed you. I do love them. That's what makes this harder. I asked her if there was any flexibility in the room setup this year. There was a pause. Oh. Well, we thought the current arrangement made the most sense. You're just one person. You know I bit my tongue, because that phrase always scraped something deep. Just one person. As if being single meant my comfort didn't weigh the same. After the call, I sat on my bed with a glass of wine and stared at my packing list. Every year I packed light. Loose t-shirts, old sandals, my second best toiletries. As if I were preparing for emotional downsizing. This year, I wrote a new list. Comfortable nightwear, a good linen set, my favorite books, an electric kettle, things that made me feel at home. I told myself this wasn't rebellion, it was redefinition. I wasn't going to wait to be treated differently. I was going to arrive differently. For once, I wouldn't apologize for taking up space. But a shift like that doesn't come without resistance. On Monday, Mom called. Her voice was its usual cocktail of cheerfulness laced with gentle pressure. She asked if I'd be able to bring extra napkins and table runners again. I said no. Not this time. She went quiet. Then she said, "That's unlike you." And I realized she was right. It was unlike the version of me they'd come to rely on. The easy one. The soft landing. Maybe it was time to introduce them to someone else. The week before the trip, I finalized my plan. I wasn't going to fight about the couch or the room in advance. I wasn't going to plead or argue or try to make them see me differently before I even arrived. Instead, I booked the little inn 5 minutes away, paid in full, and sent a brief message to my parents. Looking forward to the trip. I've arranged alternate lodging nearby. So I'll come by for meals and time with the kids. That was it. Clean, respectful, no drama, but within hours. I got a reply from my mom that made it clear she didn't see it that way. "Why would you do that?" Jared already confirmed he's bringing the topper for the couch. "There's no need to waste money. Besides, it's family vacation we're meant to be together." I didn't answer right away. I read the message 3 times and reminded myself of something Dr. Haley said: discomfort is not always an emergency. Sometimes, it's just a sign that you're doing something different. I replied simply, "It's not about the money. I just want to rest well this year. I'll still be with everyone." No one responded after that. The silence said more than any argument could. That Saturday, I packed my suitcase with the kind of care I used to reserve for business travel. Not because I expected to impress anyone, but because I was traveling for myself this time. My clothes were clean and chosen with intention. I packed a real book, not just a phone full of distractions. I brought my ceramic tea mug and a lavender eye mask. I didn't know how this trip would go, but I wanted to make sure I had the tools to protect my peace. The drive took 11 hours. I didn't rush. I stopped once for gas, once for a sandwich, and once just to sit and watch the ocean roll in near Mendocino. The weather was foggy when I pulled into the parking lot of the inn, but it didn't feel cold. Just quiet. The receptionist, a woman named Marcy, gave me the kind of welcome I'd spent years designing for other people. She handed me a real key, not a card, and showed me to a room with a small balcony and a view of the trees bending toward the sea. "If you need anything," she said softly, "we're here to help you rest." That night, I slept more soundly than I had in weeks. The next morning, I dressed without urgency, made tea in my room, and watched the mist rise off the shore. At 10 o'clock, I drove to the family house. The old beach home looked just the same. The white paint was still peeling in places no one ever fixed. The wind chime Bianca brought back from a vacation in Spain still clattered just slightly off-key. I parked on the street and carried nothing but my tote bag. I stepped into the house and felt the shift immediately. Chloe was the first to spot me, squealing and throwing her arms around my waist. "Auntie Andrea," she shouted, as if I hadn't just missed one dinner. Mason followed, more reserved. But his smile was real. Bianca gave me a one-armed hug while checking her phone. Jared offered a nod. My mom emerged from the kitchen, apron tied, face warm but clipped. "You made it," she said, as if I hadn't already announced I would. Lunch was served on the back patio like always. Burgers, chips, lemonade. When I asked quietly if there was a vegetarian option, my mom blinked and said, "Oh, I forgot, but there's salad." I didn't push. I made a plate and sat beside Mason, who showed me his new robot prototype made from paper clips and tape. It was a little miracle of focus in the middle of a very familiar feeling. I was there, but not quite seen. After lunch, Bianca asked if I could take the kids to the beach so she and Jared could nap. I said no. Just that. No excuse, no apology. Her expression didn't shift right away. It was as if she didn't know how to compute the refusal. Then she smiled a little too tightly and said, "Okay, suit yourself." I walked the bluff alone that afternoon, letting the sound of the waves replace the tension behind my ribs. I wasn't angry. Not really. I was just tired of pretending. That evening, when the family gathered for board games, I stopped by again. This time, I brought my own chair from the car. One I liked. I sat in it. I played. I laughed with the kids. I left when I was ready. It wasn't dramatic. No storming out. No confrontation. Just a quiet decision. Repeated in small ways. I would participate, but I would not contort. Back at the inn, I took a hot shower, made tea, and wrote a single sentence in my journal. This time, I'm not asking for room. I'm taking it. On the third day of the trip, things started to shift. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. My mom began referring to my hotel stay as Andrea's little getaway when talking to other relatives on speakerphone, her voice taking on that sugar-coated tone she used when correcting someone without using actual words. Bianca made a point of emphasizing how disconnected I seemed this year, even though I'd been there every day, on time, and engaging with the kids more than anyone, at one point. Jared offered me a seat in the living room, gesturing toward the old sofa bed I used to sleep on, and said, "Hey, your throne awaits." I didn't laugh. I just told him I had a real bed waiting for me, and I liked it that way. But the tension really rose the night of the family cookout. We were all out on the patio, burgers sizzling, music low, the kids running barefoot across the lawn. I brought a grain salad I'd made at the inn's guest kitchen. And when my mom saw it, she raised an eyebrow. "You didn't mention you'd be cooking. You could have helped here." I said nothing. Later, while setting the table, I heard her whisper to Bianca, "She's always been like this, off doing her own thing, making a point." I let it pass, not because it didn't bother me, but because I was starting to recognize how predictable it was. They didn't know how to react to boundaries, so they labeled them as selfishness. That night, after dinner, Mason asked if I'd help him finish a cardboard lighthouse model. I sat with him under the porch light, cutting tiny shingles from cereal boxes. He looked up once and said, "It's more fun when you're not tired." I didn't know whether to feel joy or guilt, maybe both. The next morning brought a moment I hadn't prepared for. Bianca pulled me aside near the garden, her tone half concerned, half strained. "Mom's worried you're distancing yourself. It's weird. Andrea, you're staying somewhere else and leaving early every night. It feels cold." I paused, trying to keep my voice even. "It's not about being cold. It's about protecting my peace." She scoffed slightly, folding her arms. "We all make sacrifices. It's not like the rest of us are perfectly comfortable. Mason and Chloe share a room and Jared's working on the floor in the laundry nook." I didn't reply with sarcasm, even though I could have listed 20 ways that analogy didn't apply. Instead, I just said, "Sharing space is one thing, being overlooked is another." She didn't answer right away. "Eventually," she said, "you've changed." I nodded. I had to. That evening, my dad asked to speak with me privately. We sat on the wooden bench facing the bluff, the wind curling around us. He took his time, then said, "You know your mother. She means well. She's just always believed in keeping things smooth. You choosing to stay elsewhere, it rattled her." I looked at him, watching his hands fidget with his wedding ring. "Dad, I'm not trying to rattle anyone. I'm trying to sleep on a mattress. That's all." He sighed, then said something I didn't expect. "You've been patient longer than most people would. I see that now." I should have spoken up sooner. It was quiet for a moment. I felt something shift, not dramatically, but enough to notice. Later that night, back at the inn, I opened my journal and wrote, "Even silence, when it cracks, sounds like thunder." On the 5th day, something unusual happened. The innkeeper, Marcy, introduced me to a guest named Marcus during breakfast. He was staying 2 rooms down, in town to scout a potential acquisition for a new eco-retreat brand. We ended up having coffee on the deck overlooking the water. He asked what brought me here, and I told him carefully. Without bitterness, just facts. A woman finding a place to rest after years of folding herself into other people's comfort. He nodded, then said, "That's not small. You know, that's something a lot of people never do." We didn't talk long, but as I drove back to the house that morning, I felt different. Seen, even just briefly, by someone who didn't need me to be small to keep the peace. The family had planned a group photo that day. It was a tradition, matching shirts. The bluff behind us, one arm always slightly too tight around someone's shoulder. As we lined up, my mom waved me toward the edge. "Andrea, honey, scoot a little more right. We need space for the kids in the middle." I hesitated, then said softly but clearly, "I'd like to be centered this year." It was quiet for a beat too long. Then Chloe tugged my hand and said, "You can stand by me." So I did. And the photo was taken. A small moment, but it meant everything. By the 6th day, the atmosphere around the house had shifted in ways that were hard to name but impossible to ignore. Conversations became shorter when I entered a room. My mom no longer asked if I'd be joining the group for meals. She simply informed me of the time like she would a neighbor invited last minute. Bianca avoided eye contact when she passed me in the hallway. It wasn't hostility. It was something subtler, as if my refusal to fold myself into the usual mold made me harder to locate in the family's emotional map. They didn't know where to place me anymore, so they kept a quiet distance, like someone moving furniture around a room without touching the center. That morning, I found my reusable grocery bag missing from the kitchen. Inside it had been my snacks, herbal tea, and the ceramic mug I always traveled with. I asked my mom if she'd seen it. She shrugged and said, "I think Jared moved it when clearing the counters. Maybe check the garage. I found the bag near a recycling bin, half crushed, with the handle broken clean through. The mug was cracked." I stared at it for a long time, not because it was valuable, but because it was mine, a small comfort I had packed with care, dismissed without thought. When I brought it back inside and quietly set it on the counter, no one asked what had happened. That afternoon, Mason asked if we could finish his lighthouse. We sat on the porch while the others packed up for a winery trip I hadn't been invited to. As he glued the last pieces in place, he looked at me and said, "Why don't you sleep here like everyone else?" I thought about how to answer without making the house feel heavier for him. I said, "Sometimes adults have to figure out how to take care of their peace, even if it looks different from what other people do." He nodded slowly, then said, "I like it when you're not tired." I didn't know how to explain that I had spent most of my childhood being tired in quiet ways. That being tired wasn't about sleep. It was about being invisible in the middle of the room. That evening, I returned to the inn just after sunset. I poured a glass of wine and sat out on the balcony. The air smelled like salt and pine, the kind of scent that made you feel like you were standing at the edge of something honest. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Quick question. You mentioned you work in guest experience strategy." "Right. Would love your take on something." I told him I had time. 10 minutes later, we were on a call. He explained he was scouting legacy properties for a new wellness brand and wanted insight on how to balance nostalgia with modern hospitality. We ended up talking for over an hour, not just about strategy, but about value, what it meant to design space that told people, without saying a word, that they mattered. The next morning, I got a call from Lena. I hadn't spoken to her since the trip began. I stepped outside, barefoot, on the deck, and told her everything. She listened in silence, then said, "It sounds like they're still hoping you'll fold back into the old version of you." I asked her how long it takes for people to stop expecting that. She said, "As long as you keep leaving the door cracked open, they'll keep peeking in and asking you to play the same part. You haven't just changed your bed, you've changed your role. That kind of shift makes people uncomfortable." I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me, she added, "Uncomfortable doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes it just means new." Later that day, when I returned to the beach house, my dad was standing in the driveway, arms crossed, looking distracted. He asked if we could talk. We sat at the edge of the garden, near the rosemary bush my grandmother had planted decades ago. He took a long breath, then said, "Your mother's not taking this well. She feels like you're rejecting the family." I looked at him and said carefully, "I'm not rejecting the family. I'm rejecting the version of it where I don't get to exist fully." He looked down, then said, I think we've gotten used to the version where you're the easy one, and I'm not proud of that." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He placed his hand on the wooden bench beside him, not quite touching mine, but close. It was the quietest acknowledgement I'd ever received from him, and maybe the most sincere. That night, I didn't stay for dinner. I told them I had plans. No one asked what those plans were, but as I walked back to the inn, I knew they were watching from the window, not out of suspicion, not out of anger, but out of curiosity, as if they were realizing, for the first time, that I wasn't just choosing a bed, I was choosing something else entirely. I was choosing myself. The next morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from Marcus. He thanked me for our conversation earlier in the week and said he'd mentioned my name during a project pitch to his leadership team. They were launching a new hospitality concept, a hybrid between boutique hotel and restorative retreat, and needed someone with deep experience in emotional guest design. He said he didn't know if I was looking for a shift in my career, but he'd love to introduce me if I was open. I sat there staring at the screen, blinking. Not just because it was flattering, but because it came on the heels of a week where my competence, my comfort, and even my place in my own family had been quietly dismissed. To receive professional validation from someone who had known me for less than a week felt almost surreal. But then again, maybe it wasn't surreal at all. Maybe it just stood out in contrast to how deeply I'd internalized being unseen by people who should have known me best. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I saved the message and tucked my phone away. I wanted to sit with it before deciding what it meant. That afternoon, I returned to the family house for the beach walk we did every year. This time, Bianca wasn't there. Jared said she wasn't feeling well, but his eyes didn't match his words. The group was smaller than usual, just my parents, the kids, and me. Chloe grabbed my hand, swinging it back and forth as we made our way across the sand. Halfway through the walk, my mom asked if she could speak with me privately. We stepped away from the others, toward the dunes. The wind made her hair flick across her face, and she didn't push it away. "I've been thinking," she started slowly, not looking at me directly, "about how we've handled things, about how you felt." She paused, as if measuring how far she was willing to go. I waited. "Eventually," she continued, "you've always been so capable, so self-contained. I guess I thought that meant you didn't need much from us. I didn't rush to forgive. I let the silence stretch long enough for the truth to breathe. Finally, I said, being capable isn't the same as not needing care. You assumed I was fine because I never complained. That's not the same as being okay." She nodded, a small movement, but it felt honest. "I see that now," she whispered. "I'm sorry." We walked back in silence, but something had shifted. Not everything, not overnight, but enough. That evening, when we gathered for dinner, my name was written on a place card. a small, handwritten tag propped up between Bianca's name and Chloe's. I had never had a place card before, not in all the years of these family meals. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a deliberate one. My mom didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. But when I sat down, I felt something loosen in my chest. Bianca was quiet during the meal. She picked at her food, answered questions with half sentences, and avoided eye contact when dessert came out. She got up and started clearing dishes before anyone asked. I joined her in the kitchen, for a while. We didn't speak. We just worked side by side, like two people building something fragile with their hands. Eventually, she said, "You really shook things up this year." I dried a plate and said, "I didn't mean to cause trouble." She shook her head. "No, that's the thing. You didn't cause trouble. You just stopped absorbing it." She leaned against the counter and looked at me directly, maybe for the first time since I arrived. "I know I haven't always made space for you. I think part of me assumed you didn't need it, and maybe another part didn't want to share." That admission landed heavier than I expected. I asked quietly, "Why not?" She hesitated, then said, "Because you've always been the one Mom talked about with pride," she'd say. "Andrea's doing so well. Andrea's independent. Andrea doesn't ask for anything. I guess I wanted something that felt like mine, like I mattered more here." I didn't say anything right away. There was a strange kind of relief in hearing that the favoritism I thought I lacked might have just taken a different shape. "I didn't realize it looked like that from your side," I admitted. "But I don't think love should have to feel like scarcity." She nodded slowly. "Maybe we've all been measuring the wrong things." Later that night, as I returned to the inn and stood on the balcony once more, I opened Marcus's email again. This time, I replied. I told him I'd be happy to talk further about the project after I returned to Seattle. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but something about writing that message felt like a declaration, not just of ambition, but of authorship. My story wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The final weekend of the trip arrived faster than I expected. The sun had returned after several days of fog, and the house buzzed with last-minute plans for a farewell barbecue. I showed up a little after noon, carrying a tray of grilled vegetables I'd made at the inn's outdoor kitchen. No one commented on the food, but no one dismissed it either. My mom had actually made a lentil salad, unprompted, and set it next to the burgers. It was a small gesture, but it didn't feel performative. It felt like effort. That alone made it worth acknowledging. I thanked her quietly while we stood near the sink, and she nodded without meeting my eyes. Marcus had texted me earlier that morning, asking how things were going. I told him the weather had finally caught up with the emotional climate clearing slowly, after a long haze. He replied, "That's a good sign. Some families don't let the fog lift at all." I smiled at the message, not because it was poetic, but because it was accurate. For years, I'd accepted a kind of emotional overcast without questioning it. Now, with each decision to step forward instead of shrink, the air was different. That afternoon, Bianca invited me to help set up for the group photo. She didn't say it outright, but when she handed me the clipboard and asked me to decide where everyone should stand, I understood it as more than logistics. It was a passing of quiet authority. I placed the kids in the middle, the grandparents on the bench, and instead of standing on the far left like I always had, I stood beside Bianca, not behind her. No one corrected me. No one shifted me to the end. When the timer flashed, I didn't feel like an afterthought. I felt present. The barbecue started just after 4. Jared had set up the music and grill. Chloe handed out paper fans she'd decorated with markers, each one with a name and a small drawing. Mine had a little sun and the word strong written in bubble letters. When I asked her why, she shrugged and said, "Because you don't bend like the paper plates." I don't know where she heard that line, or if she made it up, but it stayed with me long after the food was put away. I watched my family move through the evening with a softness I hadn't seen in years. Less rushing, fewer complaints. When I left around 9, no one asked why I wasn't staying later. They just hugged me and said, "See you tomorrow." The next morning, I checked out of the inn. Marcy, the woman at the front desk, thanked me for staying and wished me safe travels. She handed me a folded note before I left. "You helped remind me that peace is a choice," it said, followed by her name. I didn't know what I had done exactly, but I tucked the note into my bag anyway. Back at the house, the atmosphere was uncharacteristically calm. My parents were finishing coffee on the deck. Bianca was helping Mason zip up his overnight bag. The goodbyes were gentler this year. No guilt, no last-minute jokes about staying longer. My dad gave me a hug and said, "Let's not wait another year to talk properly." My mom kissed my cheek and said, "I hope next year you'll stay a little closer, but only if it feels right to you. For once." There was no edge in her voice, just invitation. As I loaded my car, Bianca approached with Chloe, who handed me a small envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the beach house, with every room labeled. At the bottom was a new room that didn't exist in the real house. It was labeled Andrea's room, with a tiny flower drawn in the corner. I bent down and hugged her tight. Bianca placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "We're not perfect, but we're trying. I hope you see that." I told her I did, not because everything had been fixed, but because something fundamental had changed. They no longer expected me to erase myself to belong, and that was enough. On the drive back to Seattle, the coast unfolded beside me like a slow-moving film. I stopped at the same overlook near Mendocino and took a photo. Not to post, just to keep. I thought about the project Marcus had mentioned, and the version of my life that might exist beyond accommodation and compliance, for the first time in years. I didn't feel like I was driving away from something I hadn't gotten. I felt like I was carrying something with me. Not a victory, not revenge, just self-respect, intact and unshaken. And that was more than I'd ever brought home from any vacation before. Returning to Seattle didn't feel like coming back to real life. It felt like entering the next chapter of it. The city was still noisy, the traffic still terrible, and the office still packed with deadlines. But something in me had changed so completely that even the familiar pressures didn't land the same way. On my first morning back, I stood in my kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea in a new mug I had picked up on the drive home, and realized I wasn't bracing for anything. Not for being overlooked, not for having to explain my needs in carefully edited sentences. I was just standing there, present, not performing. And it felt clean in a way I hadn't known I was missing. That afternoon, Marcus and I finally spoke again, this time over video call. He introduced me to one of the lead partners of the new hospitality concept, a soft-spoken woman named Devika, who had once designed emotional environments for trauma recovery centers before transitioning to private resorts. We talked for almost an hour, not about a job, but about purpose, about how space tells a story, and how that story can either reinforce someone's smallness or invite them to unfold. I didn't oversell myself. I didn't need to. I simply told the truth, that I knew what it meant to be placed at the edge of a room and what it took to walk back into the center without asking for permission. By the end of the call, Devika said, "We're not just building rooms. We're building permission slips for people to feel safe being whole." I knew then that I wanted to be part of that work, not because it would impress anyone, but because it aligned with who I'd become. In the days that followed, I moved through my work with renewed clarity. I said no to projects that drained me. I stopped apologizing for suggesting bold ideas, and slowly, I began to notice a change in how people responded to me. My voice wasn't louder, it was steadier, and people leaned in differently when I spoke, not because I demanded it, but because I wasn't shrinking from it. One evening, about a week after the trip, I received a voice message from Bianca. She sounded tired, Not in a dramatic way, but in the way people sound when they've been sitting with something they can't quite name. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about not waiting for others to see you. I guess I've always thought family meant default closeness, but I'm starting to realize it should mean chosen effort. I don't always know how to give that, but I'm trying." I listened twice, then sent back a text. "That's all any of us can do. I'm here." Later that weekend, I met Lena for brunch. She took one look at me and raised her eyebrows. "You're different," she said between sips of coffee. "You're walking like you take up space on purpose." I laughed because I hadn't even noticed. But she was right. I was no longer apologizing for my presence in subtle ways, no longer narrating my usefulness in every room. I had stopped measuring my belonging by how much space I didn't take. Instead, I'd begun to trust that I was allowed to take the space I already occupied. We talked about everything that had unfolded. About the cracked mug, the placement in the photo, the unexpected softness from my father. She said, "You didn't force them to change. You just stopped volunteering to carry their comfort." That line stayed with me, because that had always been my role. The emotional buffer, the quiet bridge, the peacekeeper who absorbed every unspoken tension so no one else had to feel it. Walking away from that role hadn't been loud or public. It had been 1,000 quiet choices made over 2 weeks that rewrote a lifetime of patterns. That night, as I lay in bed, I pulled out the small drawing Chloe had given me, the one with the imagined room labeled Andrea's room. I realized that it wasn't just a sweet gesture from a child. It was an early sign that even the youngest among us can see the injustice of imbalance. And sometimes they say the thing the adults are too proud or afraid to admit. That imaginary room wasn't real yet, but the idea of it was. The space where I could exist fully without being diminished. And the more I honored that idea in my life, the more real it became. Not just for me, but for everyone I allowed to meet me there. 2 weeks after the trip, I received a group message from my mom. It was a family-wide thread, something she only used for birthdays or holiday announcements. But this time, the message read, "Next year's summer vacation thinking about renting a bigger place. Or rotating rooms. Open to suggestions." That was all. No apology, no explanation. But it was the first time in over a decade that my mother had framed the vacation as a discussion rather than a decree. I didn't rush to reply. I wanted to see who else did. A few minutes later, my dad replied, "Rotation sounds fair." Then Bianca chimed in, "Let's find a place where everyone has what they need, not just what they get used to." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I needed more proof that things were shifting, but because it marked a moment I never believed would come. My absence from the sofa had made more noise than all my years of quiet presence combined. At work, things were accelerating. I'd officially accepted a consulting offer with Devika and Marcus's firm, splitting my time between that project and my current role for 6 months. It wasn't a complete leap, but it was a pivot towards something I didn't realize I had wanted: authorship. Not just participation. For years, I had poured energy into elevating guest experience while quietly accepting that my own experience, in most rooms I belonged to, wasn't part of the conversation. But now I was building spaces physical and emotional that reflected the lessons I had learned not through success, but through erasure. One Friday afternoon, I had a one-on-one with our junior strategist, a woman named Callie who reminded me of a younger version of myself. She had emailed me after a team meeting, saying she felt like her voice got buried too easily. During our call, she said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm just lucky to be here, so I don't push too hard. I don't want to be seen as difficult." I told her something I wish someone had told me years ago. There's a difference between being difficult and being clear. You're allowed to speak as if your perspective matters. Because it does. She blinked, then nodded. Not in a dramatic way, but as if she'd just been handed something she didn't know she was missing. When we ended the call, she said, "Thanks for seeing me." And I thought, quietly, maybe that's where it begins for everyone. Not with a declaration, just with someone who doesn't need you to shrink to be welcome. That weekend, I visited my parents, just a short drop-in to bring my mom a birthday gift and see if the conversation from the group message had carried into real life. The atmosphere was lighter. Not perfect, but less stiff. My dad opened the door before I rang the bell and said, "Andrea, good to see you." My mom hugged me a bit longer than usual. Over tea, we talked about little things, how Chloe had joined swim club, how my dad's garden was being eaten by rabbits again. Then my mom surprised me. She said, "I've been looking at houses near the beach. Not too big, but with enough rooms. It was never fair how we did it before." I looked at her, searching for signs of defensiveness, but saw none. Only effort. Maybe late, but still effort. Bianca called later that night, not to discuss the past, just to talk. She said Chloe was still talking about the lighthouse model, and Mason had asked when I'd be back. She didn't sound obligated or rehearsed. She just sounded like someone who missed her sister. We stayed on the phone for over an hour, moving between updates and silence and shared laughter. When we hung up, I realized it had been years since we'd spoken without a script. That evening, I sat down and wrote something in my journal I hadn't been able to put into words before. Sometimes healing doesn't look like forgiveness or closeness. Sometimes it just looks like everyone finally seeing the same picture after years of pretending it wasn't crooked. I didn't need to be the center of the family. I didn't even need to be understood completely. But I had needed this. The proof that it's possible to reclaim your place without having to force anyone to give it. A week after returning home, I sat at my kitchen counter sipping lukewarm tea, trying to make sense of the silence that had followed everything. No angry calls, no excuses, just stillness. And oddly, it felt like relief, for the first time in years. I wasn't planning my movements around someone else's comfort. I wasn't bracing for guilt or backhanded reminders. The house felt lighter, not just because they weren't here, but because I wasn't waiting to be accepted anymore. That old need to be seen, to be chosen, had quietly dissolved somewhere along the shoreline of that final family trip. I started sleeping better. My emails at work didn't trigger that tight feeling in my chest. I stopped rereading messages 3 times before hitting send. I didn't realize how much mental space my family's absence would create. Or maybe it wasn't their absence. Maybe it was the absence of hoping, of trying to prove I was worthy of the space I'd already built for myself. My niece Chloe sent me a message on a Tuesday night. It was a photo of the lighthouse model we made together, now sitting on her bedroom shelf. She wrote, "It lights up when I turn it on. I keep it on when I miss you." Just that. No punctuation, no extra words, but it landed heavier than anything else that week. I stared at the message for a long time, thinking about how kids remember the smallest kindness, while adults forget the biggest absences. I replied, "I miss you too. Tell me when you want to build the next one." I didn't hear back right away, but I wasn't worried. Chloe always answered on her own time, and I was finally learning to live on mine. That weekend, I drove past my parents' neighborhood on the way to a client meeting. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. But I noticed the lawn had been freshly mowed, and the porch still had the same sagging chair where my dad used to drink his coffee. For a moment, I imagined parking, walking up, knocking, but there was no reason, no conflict, just nothing left unfinished on my side. That was new. I had spent most of my adult life with emotional loose ends, trying to braid them into something that looked like belonging. Now, I just let them hang. At work, I gave a presentation on user experience that ended with more questions than answers. Afterward, our director said, That was the first time anyone framed user trust as an emotional contract. I nodded, not out of pride, but recognition. That's what I had always been navigating, quietly. Even outside of work, the difference between being useful and being safe, between being invited and being valued. I had just never said it out loud. I got coffee with a younger colleague named Iris, someone I'd mentored quietly for months. She asked if I ever regretted not pushing back harder when people overlooked me. I thought about that for a long time before answering. Sometimes I regret staying quiet when I knew better. But I don't regret leaving the rooms where knowing better didn't matter. She didn't respond right away, just nodded and tucked the words somewhere deep. I saw it in her eyes. By the time summer came again, I had booked my own trip. Just me. A small artist's cottage near a bay town I'd always wanted to visit. I didn't tell anyone except one friend, and even she found out only after I landed. I spent the mornings walking the rocky shore, afternoons sketching without pressure, and evenings eating alone without explaining it. It didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. On the last night there, I got a group message from my family again. It was about next year's vacation. This time, they asked everyone to vote on location and date. They used words like balance and rotation. I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I just saved it under a new folder I had created that week, one titled, If I Choose To. Because I might, or I might not. Either way. It would be a choice, not an obligation, not a test. Back at home, I started putting together my fall project, something that blended community design and emotional space planning. It was the kind of thing I used to think no one would approve or fund. But I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I had started writing the grant with a line that surprised even me. This proposal centers on the quiet resilience of those who stay, adapt, and build beauty in spaces where they were once invisible. That sentence felt like my own name for the first time. And if you're wondering whether my family ever really changed, I'll say this: people don't always change the way we need them to. But sometimes, they step back just far enough for us to see the door we didn't know we were allowed to walk through. I stepped through mine, quietly, and this time, I didn't leave it open behind me.